what is the relation between the EOS Network Foundation and EOS Network Ventures?
Both of them are going to be, I say both of them are, but realistically, the ENV doesn't exist yet. But once it exists, the idea is that both of them would be very complementary to one another. So albeit they're completely separate organizations, there's no legal link or financial link between the two. And I say this again, this ENV doesn't exist, but projected, the idea is that they both fulfill very complementary roles. So right now, the ENF as a non-for-profit has three, let's say, funding buckets that grow in size and they give an opportunity for community members and or developers, businesses to receive funding from the network. And those are Eden, Pomelo, and then the grant framework. That particular, those three pillars or those three funding vehicles, mechanisms are limited in what they can do as per our mission mandate as a non-for-profit. And so we see that it also caps out the level of funding that is possible for into entities because of that non-capacity to be able to get equity in return. So we've seen that in general, people within Eden receive, I don't know, a few $1,000s maybe a month. It gives them a platform. It gives them a voice. It gives them funding alongside that platform and that voice. That amount varies, but let's say at some point it's even maybe up to $10,000, give or take, per month, depending on with the value of the token, so to speak, but it's quite limited. But it gives a platform and gives a voice, and it's one of what I call the indirected or undirected funding mechanisms. So the ENF makes funds available in a pool, and then Eden, through its governance process, determines who gets access to that funding, in what amount, et cetera, and what they work on, et cetera. The second funding mechanism is Pomelo, also indirected in the sense that there are requirements. It needs to meet the definition of a public good and such, but the network makes available funds, and then the process of Pomelo through quadratic funding, et cetera, ultimately determine where those funds lie, who ends up with those funds. The third funding mechanism is that, and we see that those levels for Pomelo, again, depending on the matching, depending on how much is raised in contributions, varies between maybe $5,000, give or take, to $60,000, $70,000, give or take, every quarter. And so again, somewhat limited in funding, not necessarily guaranteed or certain, but it is another funding mechanism that is indirected. And so both of these relies on the wisdom of the crowds through their own governance mechanisms. The third funding bucket, which is the grant framework, that varies between, again, maybe 10,000, 5 to 10,000 to upwards of, let's say, 200, 250,000 at the very extreme edges, can be applied at any given time. No equity in return, needs to be open source. And so still some parameters around that, but it's still limited in the amount of funding that it can provide to an entity or to a particular, let's say, application or a team or something like that. Now, the ENF has been doing direct grants now for quite some time because we didn't have a vehicle outside of this. So outside of the three that I just mentioned, ENF has done multiple direct investments, but again, for no equity in return. Those would be, for example, the blue papers. It would be the latest one would be Haifa DAO. And so all of those are elaborated in the reports, the quarterly reports that we publish. But these really fit outside of the norm. And realistically, a lot of those, maybe outside of the blue papers anyways, a lot of those investments should have been made for equity in return. Because for no equity in return, the network is giving out grants and essentially determining what constitutes value from a non-equity perspective. And so a lot of it is open source, a lot of it is tooling and or public good type of investments. But there was no vehicle outside of this to be able to inject capital into the ecosystem for equity in return, so that the purpose is actually to make a profit. So that was somewhat lacking. The other thing there was there's no vehicle outside of this to be able to attract investment. So to be able to get external capital into the ecosystem in a way through a vehicle that would guarantee that the funds would go into EOS-based projects. So we saw that with EOS VC, that would align the incentives with the EOS token holders and within the EOS network. And that was able to do so effectively. We have not seen any of this. And so both of them are very complementary to one another, because ENV is essentially the response to the gaps that ENF cannot fill. And what we see right now, and this is just the beginning of, is the network anyways has reached consensus on giving the go-ahead to figure out how this will work. So a lot of it is still undetermined. A lot of it is to be confirmed, to be determined, no answer. But your original question of how are they related to one another, they're completely distinct. but they do provide, I guess, two sides of the same coin in a way, and they are very complementary to one another.